a story about a working woman, Maria, who works in the city of Chicago. One cold night, Maria stayed late at office. But it was late, much later than Maria intended to stay. The lights of the office building flickered, casting long shadows across the deserted floor. Her colleagues had left hour ago, leaving her alone in the quiet. The wind howled outside, making the cold, dimly lit cubicle feel even more oppressive. She could hear the faint tapping of her fingers on the keyboard, the only sound in the otherwise dead silence. She had been putting in overtime for weeks now, desperate to meet deadlines in a city that never seemed to sleep. Her body ached from the long hours, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not in Chicago, not in the corporate jungle that demanded perfection. Maria sighed as she grabbed her coat, adjusting her scarf, and locked up her desk. The elevator ride down was unnervingly slow. When it reached the ground floor, she stepped out into the lobby, the soft glow of fluorescent lights making her feel small and exposed. She looked at the time, nearly midnight. The city was alive outside, the streets bright with neon signs and the distant hum of traffic. But inside the building, all was still. As she walked out the front door, the biting cold air hit her face like a slap. She pulled her coat tighter around her, eyes scanning the nearly empty street. The sidewalks, usually filled with people rushing to their destinations, were now almost deserted. A few cars sped by, their headlights creating fleeting shadows in the darkness. Maria pulled out her phone, checking the time again, a familiar wave of unease creeping over her. Her apartment was just a few blocks away, but that didn't make her feel any safer. The streets she walked through were dark, with abandoned storefronts and flickering streetlights. The wind picked up, making the shadows seem longer, stretching into corners that didn't look quite right. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder. A man stood there just at the edge of the streetlight, his face obscured by the darkness. He was tall, his posture slightly hunched as if waiting for something. Maria's heart skipped a beat, her breath coming quicker as the man began to move toward her. She picked up her pace again, her footsteps now echoing through the empty street. The man matched her speed, his footsteps never faltering. She turned down another street, her mind racing. There were still no people around, just the hollow noise of distant traffic. Every time she looked over her shoulder, the man was closer. He started to jog, her breath sharp in the cold night air, but the man continued to follow, his footsteps growing louder. Panic surged through her. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. Just as her hand wrapped around it, her screen lit up. She didn't even hesitate. She pressed the call button. 911. "What's your emergency?" the voice on the other end asked. "There's someone following me," Maria gasped, her voice shaking. "I think he's going to..." Before she could finish, the call dropped. The line went dead, and she glanced down to see the phone's battery had drained completely. That was when she heard him, his voice low and raspy, barely above a whisper, called out from behind her, "You can't run forever." Maria froze, terror flooding her chest. She spun around. The man's face came into view, his skin pale, his eyes wide and unnaturally bright under the dim street light. His smile was too wide, too hungry. Without thinking, she turned and ran. The sound of her own pounding footsteps filled her ears as she sprinted down the alley, her heart hammering in her chest. The man's laughter echoed behind her, sending chills up her spine. She didn't dare look back again. The cold air burned her legs as she ran, her legs aching from exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. She would not stop. Finally, she reached the door to her apartment building. She fumbled for her keys, her hands slick with sweat, her mind racing. She heard a man's footsteps just behind her, his breath ragged and uneven, but growing closer with each passing second. Maria shoved the door open, slamming it shut behind her with a force that rattled the windows. She leaned against it, gasping for breath, her body trembling. In the silence of the hallway, she slowly peeled herself away from the door, her hands still shaking. She backed toward the elevator, her pulse roaring in her ears. When the elevator arrived, she pressed the button for her floor and stepped inside, her body numb with fear. As the doors slid closed, she thought she heard something in the distance. Whispers, or maybe the faint sound of footsteps again. She pressed her back to the wall, closing her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. When the elevator stopped, she rushed to her apartment door and locked it behind her. She collapsed against it, eyes wide, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls. But as she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. From the dark corner of her apartment, she could hear the faintest sound, the quietest whisper, "Maria." She looked up, her heart sinking. The man was still there, and now he was inside. The city that never slept had just become her nightmare.